So now I'm ready to get on with my arranging. My flowers and greenery are all here ready to hand. My mechanics have been done, so basically I've got my vase and my grid's been marked out at the top, and I've also got some water to put into my vase. So I shall put the water in now, aiming it between the holes in the grid. And again, if you're using sellotape or washi tape, you have to be just extra careful doing this, because you don't want to get your tape wet, because it will then slide off your container. So I'm being careful, but also I'm working with the Florist tape, and I know it's waterproof, so a bit of splashing is not going to matter. And it's up to you how much water you put in. I've probably put about 1/3 of the vase covered in water. I quite like with this arrangement that you have the water and then a space, and you can see the stems dangling down, and then a haze of flowers over the top. But if you prefer more water or less, it's up to you. You just need to make sure you keep an eye on the water level, because you don't want the flowers to take all the water up and then suddenly discover they've died because you haven't been topping the water up. And that's another good reason why to use a clear vase, because you can easily see what your water situation is like. So I'll just move that jug away and come back, and we'll go through the flowers and I'll show you how I do my arranging. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my flowers out of the bucket. I need to be able to see what I've got, so I'll carefully put those to one side and move my bucket of flat water away, and I'm just going to lay them out on the side here to see what's what. And what I will do is I'm going to sort them out. I'm going to put my larger flowers in one pile and then my smaller flowers in another. So those are the smaller ranunculus, and then I've got all my tulips, so we'll put those to one side there, so I know where to find them. Tulips over there again. It's a large tulip. It's starting to open out, that one. And then onto my ranunculus, which are hiding away. So sort of middle-sized ones there. So on the whole, I've just got 2 really big ranunculus, and the rest are middle-sized or buds. Then my if your flowers get tangled together, it's a matter of giving them a little bit of a shake and a wobble so you can see what you've got. So I'm going to collect a handful of my forget-me-nots, and then my flowering geranium, the everlasting wallflower, and then my selection of greens, which, as I say, I'm not entirely sure whether I'm going to be using those or not, so I'll tuck those there out of the way. So the first thing you need to do is to cut your flowers to the right length. So I'm going to start off with my biggest ranunculus, and what you need to do is hold it up against the side of your container to give you an idea of where to cut the flower. So if you're doing this on the kitchen table at home, I would move your flower vase to the edge of the kitchen table, and I'm going to have to adjust the camera now so you can see. So you move the vase to the edge of your table so that your flower stem can drop down off the edge of the table, and that will give you an idea of where to cut the stem. So if you want the flowers just hovering across the top of the container, as if their necks are just resting on the rim of the vase, I now know that I need to cut my flower here in order that it's the right length. So before you go crazy and cut all your flowers that length, I would just put them in the vase to see how it sits. Now that sits a bit higher, and it's because the vase has a slight plinth at the bottom, so I will just go back in and cut off another tiny little bit. So I think that looks about right. So having got the height of the first flower, I can then take that out, and with my other larger ranunculus, go through and use that as a measure. Now what I would say at this stage is don't get too snipper happy, because you'll find that as you cut the flowers that you're not being exactly precise, and you don't want to cut too long or too short. So just sort of go a few at a time, and as you put them into the vase, they'll move around to begin with. Don't worry about that. And all I'm aiming to do is to put one flower into each hole. So again, I've got the next lot of flowers to work with. So I'll come back measure and cut. Just make sure it's the right size. That looks good. Come back in with some of the smaller flowers. And my tip here as well is to work with one flower at a time. So I'm not moving from my forget-me-nots to my tulips and back to my ranunculus. My ranunculus are my biggest and perhaps my more interesting looking flower. So I'm working with those first of all to make sure that they fit in the vase. That one's a tiny bit long, even though I've measured it up. And the flowers, as I say, will just sort of flop over to one side a little bit because there's not enough in there at the moment to support them. And then I'll come back in with a handful of tulips. Now these tulips, as they do grow in water, so I'm going to measure it up at the side, but I'm going to hold the flower down quite low. So it seems such a shame, doesn't it, to take off a whole length of the tulip. So it's sitting down quite low, and then over the next few days, as the tulips begin to grow, I've got the option of either letting them do their thing or going back in and cutting them back down again. So it's entirely up to you what to do, but it's all part of nature and the changing form and shape of your flowers. Here, where I've had to cut that leaf, is going to be in the way, so just peel the leaf off. So you just work slowly through. So those tulips are a little bit more open. The purples that I've got here are tighter closed, and it's nice to get a variation between what flowers that you've got fully open and what flowers you've got closed. So as I put those in, I might keep some of that green because it's nice to have a bit of a flash of green, breaking up the mass of the flower heads. And not overthinking where I'm putting the flowers, just aiming to evenly distribute them throughout. And clearing away your rubbish as you go, so you can see what is flower and what is rubbish. So I'll just have a tidy up and I'll come back. So I've had a bit of tidy up, just making sure I haven't lost any flower heads. And what about that I mean is these lovely little buds that you don't want those to be accidentally thrown away, because you can use those in your arrangements as well. So again, measuring up. And with the tinier flowers, you might want them to hover, slightly higher above your vase. And again, it's entirely up to you, but I wouldn't come too high, because the point of the design of this arrangement is that everything's quite low and nestled down, and an arrangement really perhaps to be viewed from the top. And that you'll find as well if you want to put a flower in that's got quite a lot of depth to it. So this spike, that you might need to get rid of some of the flowers as well, so that when you put it in, it's not jostling with everything else. So just a bit of flash of purple there. So all you're seeing is the top of the flower. You're not seeing the length of it as well. So just measuring up everything before I put it in. After a while you might be able to eye it up, but I would just, as a matter of caution, when you're starting out, is just to think carefully about it and not rush. Enjoy the process of arranging. So what I'm aiming for here is for the flower stems reaching the bottom of the vase, with just the green stems to look at. If you cut your flowers too short, you'll find they want to escape out of the vase, and especially if you're using heavy flowers like a rose, that they'll be too top heavy. Now I'm going to come in now with my geranium just for a bit more of a flash of green. It's exactly the same thing. I measure it up against the side of the container. I know where I can cut and slide those in. I'm going to separate this mass of ranunculus petals, and all you see at the top are the little flashes of green surrounding the buds. So these ones haven't opened yet, so that will be a nice surprise in the next few days as the flowers start to open. And it may be that if the fully open geraniums look as if they're going over, I could just slide those out of the vase, and then the unopened geraniums will take their place. And of course you can be adjusting and turning and looking in all directions to make sure you're happy with the look you've got, and just making it look really, really beautiful. So again, the last geranium here, and just making sure I'm I'm not overthinking where they go, but I'm not making sure they're not all together at the same place. So just as if it's a random patchwork of flowers at the top. So I do seem to be quite green here. So I will come back in perhaps with another the wallflower, measure that up, and just to break up that mass of green. So actually that leaf there will fold up a little bit and won't be so obvious. It'll be wrapped around the geranium. I've got a bit of a gap here, so I can come back in either with a tulip or another of my ranunculus, measure it up at the side, and that can fill in that gap there. So you just keep going round and filling it in as much as you possibly can. But what I'm aiming for is something quite flat. I'm not coming out at the sides. That would be a different type of arrangement. But of course it's your flowers, so you do what you want. And so it pleases you. Now, as I pick my forget-me-nots, and they're only quite a short season on these, I'm going to put these in as well. And again, to take off more of those lower petals and leaves than I thought. So it's just a spike of flower at the top. Measure it up. And these will look really beautiful. Now, over time, with these being inside, you'll find that probably some of the flower heads will fall off and it'll be like confetti scattered around the edge of the vase. So I quite like that when it happens. But if you prefer a neater home, you might want to be clearing those up as soon as they fall. So here I'm being quite delicate with the flowers. And you'll see I'm sort of finding my way into the flower head, into the mass of flowers, measuring up and just gently making sure I'm not damaging anything. It's a really good way of doing that is to hold your flower like a pen, and then as you work your way through, lifting those flower petals up and just finding a gap between the flowers and separate it out. So the blue here is quite distinctive. I've got 1, 2, 3 placements there, so I will need to make sure I bring an equal amount of blue out to the other side as well. So across here. And of course, if you feel anything is in the wrong place, it's really easy. Just gently lift the flowers out and then reposition them if you think you've got something wrong. And I can see, in fact, that my tulips have sunk down a bit, so I can just lift those up. And just to be, reasonably delicate with the flowers. You're aiming really to get hold of the stem rather than holding the flower head, but sometimes when they're really pushed down, you've got no other option but to go for holding the flower head. So just trying to make sure that blue isn't too dominant and just looks like it's been scattered in rather than those. And then with its extra side pieces, what I'm going to do is I shall put those in as well, just as a contrast with the buds for the fully open ranunculus. It may be that some of these don't actually open, but I might as well enjoy them. I've paid for them, so I might as well use them. So getting rid of all the leaves and the stems there, measuring them up at the edge so that that'll all be the right height. And then, as I did with the forget-me-nots, just coming through, and every time I see a little bit of a gap, I can just have a little head nodding up to say hello, putting off that leaf there, finding my way down. Sometimes it's handy when you're putting the flowers in again, sort of as well as holding them as if you were holding a pen. It's just a corkscrew, a little bit of a corkscrew action, just to get them down if they don't seem to slide down easily the first time. And there, I think that probably that arrangement is done. I don't feel I can put any more into it, so I've got some other flowers I can enjoy in another arrangement at home. But that's what you're aiming for, is an arrangement in a glass vase, just because I like seeing the stems hanging down, water at the bottom, the gap and the space with the stems, and then that gorgeous head of flowers that you can really look down on. So I would put this on my coffee table in the living room. You could have it on your kitchen table to welcome you at breakfast. Probably a little bit too large to have in your bedroom on the side table, but if you've got a dressing table, you might find that there's room for them there.